everybody. Welcome to Ask the Insider, our latest episode brought to you by Allergy Insider. It is a beautiful day, and you can probably tell that we are outside. We are here in Central Park in New York City, filled with trees and plants and pollen.
And that's going to actually play into, what we're going to talk about today, the oral allergy syndrome. So we're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're just letting people join. But yeah, it's the park. So you may hear some kids playing. You may hear a siren go by. It's a great day in New York.
It sure is. It's beautiful, beautiful spring day. Thanks everybody for joining us. I see lots of likes and hearts coming in. Appreciate that. If you have questions along the way, our man Luke behind the camera is going to be helping us work through those towards the end. So put your questions or your comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as possible.
Looks like we've got quite a few people joining, so we'll just give it another minute or two, and then we'll officially get started with this month's episode, I guess, of Ask the Insider.
Yes, so while we're waiting for people to join, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about this great background that we have here in Central Park. Not too sunny, a little windy today, but with the wind comes pollen, right? The trees are pollinating in New York for sure. And how many species are here in the park, Gary?
Dozens of species, but over 20,000 planted trees are actually in this park, which is pretty amazing.
20,000 planted trees with pollen blowing all over the place. If you are somebody that suffers from allergies, this could certainly be not so pleasant of a day in the park.
For sure. Are we ready to get started?
I think so.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks for joining us. My name's Becky Rosenberger. I'm one of the insiders from Ask the Insider, brought to you by Allergy Insider. And for those that haven't seen me before on one of the episodes of Ask the Insider, I'll give you a little bit of my background. So I'm a practicing physician assistant for now over 20 years. Most of those I have actually known my colleague Gary here, who will introduce himself in just a moment. So I've been a practicing PA. Most of that time has been spent in allergy and immunology. And actually, my allergy practice is just over the river in New Jersey. So pretty convenient for us. But also, I'm the Associate Director of Clinical Affairs and Education at Thermo Fisher Scientific. And I'm super excited to be able to be here live in person with my great friend and colleague, Gary Falsitano. So Gary, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Becky. So yeah, Becky and I have known each other for over 20 years. I have been a licensed PA, physician assistant, for over 25 years actually. I've spent a lot of that time in emergency medicine, disaster medicine, and primary care. But the last 10 years, we've actually been colleagues at Thermo Fisher Scientific in the immunodiagnostics division, where I currently am the clinical affairs manager for allergies. So we talk about allergies on a daily basis. We educate clinicians, specialists, primary care providers, and we work with researchers really that are advancing the science. So we're just really excited to be here with you today and talk about a pretty interesting topic, right? It's called oral allergy syndrome, or the other name for it is pollen food allergy syndrome.
Yes, and I think it's perfect timing. We already mentioned spring. Spring is in the air here at the park, and coming up tomorrow is Earth Day. So all things spring, but you may be wondering why it's spring and tree pollen so important when we talk about oral allergy syndrome. So I know in my allergy practice, Gary, I get a lot of people that come in and they say, I get itchy in my mouth when I eat an apple. And they think that it has something to do with the actual apple or something that's on the skin of the apple. Pesticides, yep. Right? But really, it isn't necessarily the apple at all, but something that is inside the apple, a protein inside the apple. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about oral allergy syndrome and how it really relates to these apples?
Sure. So Oral allergy syndrome is it's a condition, right? When people eat various types of plant foods, they have a localized reaction in their mouth, typically, sometimes the back of their throat, but it's all confined to that upper airway, GI tract. And they typically don't have any systemic symptoms. So, when we think about food allergies, we often think about the worst kind of food allergies, anaphylaxis, severe systemic reactions, right? That's not the case with oral allergy syndrome. It's really confined to just the tissues of the upper airway. Excuse me. So, what causes it? And that's why we're here in the park, that's why we're talking about pollen. Right now it's spring, so there's a lot of tree pollen in the air. Those 20,000 trees are all in various stages of pollination. And there's proteins in that pollen that are very similar to the proteins in different plant foods. So things like apples, even tree nuts or peanuts, other celery. So there's these
peaches.
Peaches,
lots of fruits.
Right? Pitted fruits in general. And those proteins, again, look very similar to the ones in the pollen. So if you're allergic to pollen, you have seasonal allergic rhinitis, or some people call it hay fever, right? If you have that, and then you eat a fruit, your body thinks those proteins in the fruit are identical to the ones that are in the air, and it causes symptoms.
Sort of like your body thinks you're eating a tree.
Exactly. And if you chewed on a tree, you might have symptoms too, or grass, because we know that there's other things that cause this oral allergy syndrome, such as grasses and weeds, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
My dog eats a ton of grass. I often wonder, does he have oral allergy syndrome? Let's hope not. So, patients come in, they tell us, I get itchy when I eat this apple, when I eat this certain food. How can we help ask good questions, or patients know what to think about to know, is it truly an allergy to that food, or could it be this pollen food allergy syndrome? So what's a question that you ask?
Well, the first thing you want to know is, right, well, what did it? What are the circumstances around you having the symptom, right? So if you ate an apple and you got immediate or very close to immediate symptoms in your mouth, okay, that we're going to click off or check off that part of the history, but then we're going to take a deeper dive, right? Are there any other fruits or nuts or plant foods that cause similar symptoms? So then we start putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Sure.
Right? And then what do we want to know? We want to know, do you have allergic rhinitis, right? Do you have symptoms at specific times of the year? Or do you have them in the spring, the fall? We know people can have year-round allergic rhinitis too from indoor allergens, but specifically when they're related to pollens, they're usually very temporal, right? They're associated with specific seasons.
One of my favorite things, if somebody says, I get itchy when I eat a fresh apple or a fresh picked apple, I say, have you ever had an apple pie? And what happened then? It's
funny, they could tolerate that apple pie, right?
They could tolerate the apple pie. Probably not as healthy, right? I wish it was the other way around. But why is it that someone could tolerate an apple pie but get itchy when they eat a fresh apple?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, right? Because these proteins that are in the pollen and that are then the similar proteins in the food, they're called labile proteins. So what that means is they can be denatured, or their shapes can be changed by heating. So when you bake that apple pie, you're actually changing the shapes of those proteins. And when you change the shape, your body can't recognize them as something it's allergic to, so it doesn't react.
The other thing about a lot of the fruits is the skin that you talked about before. And so I've had patients tell me, well, if I peel the apple or I peel the peach and then eat it, doesn't happen as much. And it really has to do with the concentration of proteins in the skin of the apple. Not a pesticide, not something that, has been put on the apple, but really the concentration of it in the skin.
Exactly, because a lot of these proteins are concentrated in the skin of the fruits. Once the fruit has been skinned, there's less of these proteins. Now, there still can be some, right, in the fruit portion, the pulp, the flesh portion of the fruit, but that's not necessarily where the majority of them are, which is why those skinned fruits can sometimes be.
Great. So we really talked about tree pollen because we're in the Northeast right now, and it is tree pollen season. I always like to tell people pretty much by St. Patrick's Day or April Fool's Day through till Memorial Day, you're in tree pollen season anywhere in the Northeast region. We know that can be different for different parts of the country. Certainly it is. But does this really only happen with tree pollen and those foods, or are there other pollen food allergy syndrome culprits?
Yeah, no, there certainly are, right? So I mentioned, initially that there are kind of those triggers that can be caused by grass pollen, by weed pollen. So, you mentioned St. Patrick's Day as being the kickoff for tree pollen season, but when you start getting in the Northeast, when we start getting around Father's Day, right, we start to really get a predominance of grass pollens. And those will last pretty much throughout the summer. And then layering on top of that, come towards the late summer or so, we're going to start seeing weed pollens. And typically the further north you are in the country, the later those weed pollens actually come into play and start pollinating. So if you're up in Maine, you may not see them until mid or late September.
But they certainly can last even through till the first frost or the first real cold spell in a given area. So it's important to really know which pollen season is happening where you live. And then really start to put that together with if you have any symptoms based on certain foods. So is there an easy way for people to know what food is associated with which pollen? I mean, it sounds like a puzzle.
Right. I mean, I remember some of them, right? But I don't remember all of them either. So if you actually look on Allergy Insider and you look under the oral allergy syndrome or the pollen food allergy syndrome page, you can actually find a chart that lists the different pollens, grass, trees, and weeds, and which fruits and foods they're associated with that cause the oral allergy symptoms.
So what are some of your favorites?
So, ragweed comes to mind, right? So we're going to start seeing that in late summer, and that's associated with things like bananas and kiwis and avocados, right? So when you're sensitized to ragweed, you can have those mouth reactions to those type of fruits and foods. Latex is another one because, why don't you tell us a little bit about latex?
Sure. People forget that latex comes from a tree. And so therefore...
The rubber tree, right?
Yeah, the rubber tree. You can have the same proteins in latex as you do in some of those foods. And, we're in the park, right? There's probably some balloons around here. But we've really seen a decrease in latex allergy because of hospitals and, offices, even dentist offices using less and less latex because so many people were sensitized to latex. So we see a bit less of that. I know we heard an ambulance driving by before, and Gary said, "Oh, I bet that ambulance doesn't have any latex on it." Not anymore.
No, we've really made great efforts to get almost all healthcare settings latex free. But that doesn't mean there's not latex right in the environment, right? We have latex balloons, we have latex condoms. I mean, there's still a lot of places where people are exposed to latex where they can certainly have symptoms, and some of that could be related to ragweed pollen.
Yeah. And it's important to know really what is the culprit that got someone sensitized, and then what are the associated symptoms that go along with it. Not everybody that is allergic to birch trees is going to have oral allergy syndrome when they eat an apple or some of the foods. It is one of the highest though. So tree-associated pollen food allergy syndrome is actually the highest. I think there's somewhere around 40% of patients that are sensitized to birch tree pollen may have symptoms with at least one of the foods, and it's a little less for grass and ragweed for sure.
Exactly. You mentioned grass, so there's a couple of foods that are specifically associated with grass pollen allergy, right? So that may be things like strawberries or melons. Can you think of some others? I always need to consult the chart, but
melons are
probably the
that
biggest, right?
Me.
Exactly.
And it's interesting because when do we tend to eat melons? When are they in season? Summer, same time that a lot of people have grass pollinating seasons, and so can you talk to us, Gary, a little bit about why people may experience symptoms at some times of the year with oral allergy syndrome, but maybe not others? Why would that happen?
Yeah, so for instance, if I eat that apple in December, I may have minimal symptoms, but I eat the same apple now in the spring and I've got a lot of symptoms. So I think that's pretty common. I definitely hear that a lot from patients. And it's because when you think about allergy is really a cumulative threshold disease, which means the more things that we're sensitized to and exposed to, the more reactive our bodies become. So in the springtime, if I'm having some allergic symptoms to the pollen that's present, the tree pollen that's present, and then I eat that apple, it kind of adds on top of that, right? And I think you've mentioned the cup runneth over, right? Kind of, so things kind of build up, and then what happens is you eat that apple and it causes it to spill over, and that's when you have all these symptoms, right? So perhaps, maybe avoiding those foods that give you issue at the peak pollen times that are associated with those foods can really be all that you need to do to minimize your symptoms.
It really is a little bit of a puzzle, and you have to know both the indoor and outdoor sensitizations, and then also, are there foods related to them, and is that a true allergy to the food, or is it this cross-reactivity? So can you talk us through a little bit of what that would look or sound like if a patient went into a healthcare provider's office with that complaint of my mouth gets itchy when I eat an apple, and yes, I get some rhinitis symptoms in the fall. What does that look and sound like?
Yeah, so, kind of like we said before, right? We need to do a really good history and physical, figure out what they're eating, what the symptoms are, what the relationship, the timing is between the two. And then once we've explored kind of that and the associated foods that may or may not give you symptoms, kind of work your way through a list. And that's why, allergy is a little bit, not unlike a lot of parts of medicine, it's detective work, right?
Certainly.
So, and it's putting pieces of the puzzle together. So the history and the physical exam is certainly one important piece of the puzzle, but then what do we need to do? We need to add on to that to give us more insight and do a diagnostic test. So, maybe you could explain the types of diagnostic tests that are available.
Sure. So we talk a lot about in vitro specific IgE blood testing and skin prick testing. And for the most part, traditionally, those have been done with whole allergen. So everything that is in that birch tree, every protein, it's that entire soup that either you're putting on someone's skin, usually done by an allergist or in an allergy practice, or you're detecting the IgE to that in someone's blood. But that doesn't tell the whole story. So in a way, we were a bit limited for decades in only knowing that degree of sensitization. Allergen components really changed that. And as the number of allergen components that we can test for has increased, it has really helped that detective work you talked about.
It has, because we know that people get tested for, say, a peanut allergy. I had some symptoms, or they get tested for whatever reason. Maybe they have a first-degree relative with peanut allergy, and we're worried about that. And they get tested, and their whole extract, right, the complete soup, whether that be a skin test or a blood test, says they're sensitized. So they have an elevated level of antibodies. But that doesn't tell us whether they're really clinically allergic or not. We have to kind of marry that with symptoms. Where the components come in is to take a little bit deeper dive and put in a few more pieces of the puzzle. So there's a component in peanut, it's called RH8, and that's we call it a PR10 protein, but it's the birch pollen protein. So it looks almost identical to a protein in the birch pollen. And that can actually cause your peanut test to be positive even if you don't have symptoms when you eat peanut, or you have oral allergy symptoms when you eat a peanut.
Yeah, and we talked about the fresh apple versus the apple pie. It doesn't work that way for the nuts, though, say peanut or hazelnut. If you cook a peanut or roasted peanut butter, it doesn't break down the same way that
it doesn't.
The apple does.
I don't think we understand exactly why that is, because we do know. Wow, somebody's got a nice loud engine there, but you know, with peanut, we've actually seen that they can almost become more allergenic when they're roasted, right? So it doesn't quite work the same way, but it does work the same way with digestion in that ARAH8. So ARAH8 is very labile to our acids in our stomach and does break down, which is why you can end up just having oral allergy syndrome with a sensitization to this pollen-related protein of ARAH8.
As soon as there's a nut, especially peanut, involved, though, and someone has, you know, symptoms, I think it sets off some red flags for sure. So it can be a little bit scary to try to figure that out, and just the time that it can take until you can see someone and figure out, is this really a true allergy to, say, a peanut or apple, or could it be driven by a tree pollen allergy?
Sure.
For sure. Excellent. Well, we talked a little bit about the testing and how you can get to that accurate diagnosis and figure out the puzzle of pollen food allergy syndrome. Now the question becomes, what the heck do you do about it once you know?
Yeah. I mean, so, you know, I think we mentioned one of the things you can do once you know that it is pollen that's causing it. You know, maybe, you take a deep breath. You know, you're pretty confident you're not going to have a systemic reaction, especially when you've done that in consultation with your healthcare provider. So what can you do? I mean, the number one thing you can do is avoid the food, but you may not want to do that, right? It may be a favorite food. So maybe, as we said, maybe you avoid the food during that peak pollen season, so you don't have symptoms, or your symptoms aren't you know, very significant. Or what else would you recommend to one of your patients?
Yeah, well, like I said before, if it's something they can peel, sometimes that helps. I've had some patients who get it when they're handling some of the foods, like raw carrots. Yeah,
meals.
Carrots and peas have done it especially. And so maybe you can get somebody else to cook for you. that would be helpful.
And cooking, right? And we mentioned the apple pie, you know, cooked carrots, right? But baking or microwaving, really heating those foods up so that we destroy those labile or easily destroyed proteins.
Sure. And certainly the medications that are available that treat and help manage pollen allergies, they can be helpful, but we know that there are essentially the number one treatment for an allergy is avoid the allergen. But really the second thing is, how can you make a patient less allergic or desensitize them? So sometimes we do consider immunotherapy, whether it's allergy shots or another form of immunotherapy, pills or drops, to make someone less sensitized to the pollens, and that can also help them to be less reactive with that pollen food allergy syndrome.
Right, to those proteins in the food that look like the pollen, right?
Yeah.
So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to see if there are some questions or comments, and hopefully Luke will guide us here and see what has come in over the chat.
Yeah. So one of the biggest questions asked for food pollen allergy syndrome is, will it result in anaphylaxis?
Oh, great question. So will oral allergy syndrome, or what we've been now calling pollen food allergy syndrome, can it result in anaphylaxis? Why don't you take that one, Gary, and tell us a little bit of the difference. We keep going back and forth and saying oral allergy syndrome and pollen food allergy syndrome. You know, explain that difference. And can it result in anaphylaxis? So
that's the exact reason why the nomenclature has changed somewhat, right? So the overall condition is known as pollen food allergy syndrome, because that very distinctly describes exactly what's going on, right? You're sensitized to pollen, you have symptoms when you ingest a food that has a similar protein. Oral allergy syndrome is a manifestation of pollen food allergy syndrome. So with oral allergy syndrome, you're only having oral symptoms. That is, by definition, not anaphylaxis. So with oral allergy, you really can have anaphylaxis. However, if you're sensitized to a pollen and you ingest the food that has the similar pollen, as part of that pollen food allergy syndrome, there is the remote possibility that you could have a systemic reaction. And I referred to that when we talked about, the RH8 in the peanut, and maybe eating a whole lot of peanuts and overwhelming your body's ability, your stomach's ability to denature that protein with the acid.
Sure.
So yes, it can happen. It's not a very common thing, but it certainly can happen. And that's why, we want to do everything, kind of make recommendations always in light of the patient's specific history, and that's an individual patient healthcare provider discussion.
Yeah, and certainly if there's other cofactors that are happening, if somebody has asthma or there are other medications or situations that they're exposed to at the same time within a pollen season and eating some culprit foods all at the same time, then the cup can certainly runneth over.
For sure.
So, is this something that happens all year long then, or is it only in the spring, like you're saying, when the pollen is out?
Right. Great question. So, is oral allergy syndrome something that happens all year long? So, it can be, because remember that if you're sensitized to a pollen, that IgE antibody is floating around in your blood all the time, and it's waiting to see if you're exposed to that allergen. Now, you may only be exposed to birch pollen, say, in the spring, but you can be exposed to apples, certainly, all year long. We do know that within the pollen season, though, whichever is the culprit pollen, it can be worse, so you have more symptoms. So some people don't necessarily experience it all year long, but they have it worse at certain times of the year. So that's a bit of a clue to know as well. But you can have the symptoms throughout the year, but certainly we see it at a peak during those peak pollen seasons.
Yeah,
Anything
absolutely.
else to add?
No, I don't think so. It certainly can happen all year round.
So, when it comes to examples of cross-reaction between different foods and pollens, are certain foods and certain cross-reactions more severe based on the food or pollen?
Great question. So can you tell severity around pollen food allergy syndrome? So that's it's a little tricky because it really is based upon which protein is triggering the symptoms.
And the quantity of that protein you're exposed to, right?
So, and I really think that that's where allergen components have changed how we look at this mystery, as we said before, because you can help identify which type of protein is the driver, and based upon that, then say, is that a higher risk protein or a lower risk protein? And get some sense for where a patient may be on that severity spectrum. But everyone is different, everyone has a different threshold, so you really have to put all those pieces of the puzzle together to be able to determine. And there is no magic ball to say you will react at this time or you won't react at this time. You can give probabilities, but that's not as close
So
as
everybody's
we can get.
different, and it really does. We do combine, the testing results, the clinical history, and that's where that conversation and kind of shared decision making needs to happen between patients and the healthcare provider to really decide what's the best course of action for them.
Yeah.
And finally, how can you get tested to discover if you have this syndrome or disease?
Sure. A lot of different ways that you can access testing. So certainly Allergy Insider is a great resource to help guide through the options of testing.
Yep, there's a Get Tested page there.
And as we talked about before, it really starts with that history and symptoms. So patients can make sure that they know what their symptoms are, right? Keep track of that. My symptom profile is helpful so that you can take that into a healthcare provider.
Which is also on Allergy Insider. Right.
And then say, here are my symptoms, this is what's happened with which foods, and then be able to determine what type of testing is really indicated for it. And we talked through, blood testing, skin testing, and certainly
Combination of
component
both
testing.
sometimes. Yep. So it can be done at the primary care level, right? At the even some urgent care level, but also at the specialist, at the allergist or the pulmonologist. If you happen to be seeing a pulmonologist for your asthma, the blood testing can be ordered in any of those settings, and typically the skin testing is done at the allergist office.
Great. Any other comments or questions, Luke? Awesome. Thank you guys all for joining us today. Thanks for joining us in beautiful Central Park for this episode of Ask the Insider. We'll see you next time.
Make sure you tune in. See ya.